Welcome everybody to the 37th Derek's live chat show. I'm Derek Gardner. It's a great pleasure for you to join me. Today I'm with Mike Williams. I've known Mike for longer than we both care to remember, but I've worked for Mike both in Qatar and in Dubai twice, where he was kind enough to invite me out there and speak to his people. Mike at the time was once CEO of the National Bank of Fujairah. The second time he was the CEO of the International Bank of Qatar, and the third time he was working for a recruitment consultant where he was the chairman. Great fun, and I learned a lot. And I must admit, when I first went to Dubai, I didn't know anything about the culture or the cultural negotiations, and Mike briefed me very clearly, which was great. I'm not quite sure if I made any faux pas, but I probably did. I remember when I was in Dubai, a fourth time, working for an engineering company, I went to shake hands with a Muslim lady who very, very, very politely declined my handshake and very graciously got me off the spot. I hadn't really taken that into account as I went round everybody. Mike, I'm just muting everybody now, so you will have to unmute. Guys, don't forget to pass on to people the chat shows and the YouTube links. We have 3 pages of these now, talking to all sorts of very interesting people. Mike, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate that. International negotiations couldn't be any more important at the moment as we negotiate Brexit under a time deadline, which is imposed by the Brits. Europe would like to extend that. But Mike, the first question for you is, what's the most difficult situation you've been in on a negotiation?
Well, apart from negotiating your fee when you came out to Dubai, well, I think probably the most difficult one is the first one in a new environment, and it applies wherever you are. And one thing I want to say, actually, what we're talking about sort of cultures and international negotiations, but actually some of the biggest challenges I've faced have actually been in the UK in terms of negotiation, where you're dealing with people from a totally different culture and who seem to be working to a different set of rules. So I think one of the things that struck me when I first went to work in the Middle East was, and I hadn't prepared particularly well, I have to say, was the best way I found of learning how to handle myself was to listen to people who were much more experienced in it. And one of the great things about Dubai when I went there at the end of 1999, and it was sort of still relatively new ground then, I mean, everybody knows it today, but then it was not many people did. There was a whole group of people, mostly British expats who'd been there for 20 or 30 years. And I learned fairly quickly that the best way forward was just to take their advice and listen to them and watch and observe. Because I made a few mistakes in the first few transactions or negotiations I had. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire, as it turned out, but fortunately I survived it.
Can you share one of those mistakes you made with us?
Yeah, I guess the one that struck me most, and I still remember the day very clearly. I was sitting, and this was a sort of an internal thing. So I had, within the bank, I had a chairman who was a sheikh, so, you know, very important personage in the emirate, and a deputy chairman who was a wise old man, an Arab, who'd been around the block a bit, probably in his 70s at the time. We were having a conversation about a member of our staff that actually I was of the opinion was actually somebody who was worth keeping. Both of them disagreed, really. And we had a conversation about the right course of action. I made the mistake of actually saying to the deputy chairman, this wise old man, and age is a very important, seniority is a very important concept in the Gulf. I think you're totally wrong on this, and those were my exact words. And there was this horrible silence, and then the meeting finished. And the next day I was summoned and told that I'd embarrassed this senior person in front of the sheikh, and I shouldn't speak to him again. And I was, it was a lesson really, because I'd sort of gone there having worked for a Japanese securities house, which is a very sort of entrepreneurial, high pressure, do it, get it done, say what you think environment. And then, so I was sort of used to say what I thought really, and I felt I should have an opinion as CEO, and they would value it. But so I was totally wrong on that. So I learned that. I never did it again, by the way. So.
And did you really have to eat sheep's eyes when you went out to dinner?
I never did. It's one of those sort of, there's lots of stories about things that happen in any environment. I worked for a Japanese entity once, and there were similar stories there, I think, which we'll get on to. But I was at a dinner with a chap who was actually working for a UK exporting company, who was also a guest there. I think it was his first ever visit, and he was wound up a little bit by the locals, and he was told he had to eat these sheep's eyes. It was, an important part of the culture and what he should do. So he did, poor bloke. And of course, they were all howling. It was so. I think it's one of those stories. But actually, it's important. I'd been there then 2 or 3 years, so I sort of knew what was going on, and that made a big difference. Had it been me my first time around, I probably would have done. Actually, I think you try very hard to fit in. But the whole thing about business meals, for example. I think they're an important part of every culture, and they take different shapes. The days of the city meals that you and I remember, Derek, where it was 4 gin and tonics and red and white wine and Madeira to follow, and then you got down to business, I think have gone. Probably just a good job that it has. But
that was just the first course, Mike, wasn't it?
Yes. Meals are important. I remember going to a sort of fairly formal banquet in Fujairah, which is one of the smaller emirates, and I was guest of honour. I don't quite know why, but I was. I happened to be sitting next to the deputy ruler, and I hadn't realised that every time I wasn't looking, he put more food on my plate, and I kept eating it. I was about, I don't know, I must have been eating for about 2 hours. This stuff kept coming, and I thought, well, it's rude. I must eat it. It's bad manner. We're brought up to eat everything, aren't we? I think in the UK. And of course, I bet somebody actually tapped me on the shoulder and said, you don't have to eat this. And of course, the etiquette is if you show that you're hungry all the time, they feel obliged to feed you. So it's perfectly acceptable not to eat everything. So these things are in hindsight amusing, but at the time, of course, I was sitting on the floor as well, which doesn't make it very easy. And went home with all sorts of stuff in my turnips, but that's another story. But
brilliant, Mike. Before we move on from the Middle East, there's quite a big difference, isn't there, between Qatar, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, despite the fact they're not very far away from each other. What did you see as the difference?
Well, that's a very important point. I remember your little talk last week, Derek, and the first thing on your list was preparation, and part of the preparation, I think, for any person going to, and it's not just applying to the UAE or the GCC, it's just getting to know and understand the territory. And one of the biggest mistakes I used to see, and I used to get a lot of visitors, a lot of people would fly in and want to talk to us, and selling us investments and various other things. And they were, more often than not, they didn't know what they were talking about. And they assumed that Saudi Arabia and Dubai were the same place, or that Iran and Iraq were the same place. And you sort of learn very quickly that when you're talking or making conversation with your clients or colleagues, then you have to be very careful to talk about your place in positive terms. Actually, I think generally you would want to do that anyway, I think, and not confuse places. One of the mistakes that people make, for example, is they think Dubai is the capital of the UAE, and of course it's not. Abu Dhabi is, and you go to Abu Dhabi and start talking up Dubai, it's probably not necessarily the wisest thing to do, and it's a bit rude actually. So understand where you are, and equally understand the differences, particularly at the moment. There are big differences between not so much cultures, but the way people operate, and the inherent conservatism of some of the countries, religious conservatism compared with others. I mean, Dubai is a great place to be, but it's very different. Those of you, I don't know, how many people have been to Dubai?
Hands up.
Yeah, okay.
Not many, not as many as I thought, actually. I found Qatar really different. I mean, one of the facts was that you put me in a dry hotel, Mike, or was that the other company? I ordered a beer, and I got a very rude remark from the waiter. It wasn't you. You looked after me, but it was the other company, and also it seemed much more serious.
I haven't been for a couple of years, but it's a smaller population, of course, and despite its wealth, it was, from my experience, more conservative. I mean, alcohol, I'm not sure it's necessarily the measure of conservatism or not, but it was more readily available in Dubai than it was in Qatar. In Qatar, I think they probably have restricted it even more since I was there. So, I mean, you have to respect that and understand it and work within it. I mean, it'd be interesting to see how the Football World Cup's going to work in that environment, but if you understand, and this goes back to my first point really, if you prepare and have talked to people that have, particularly people who have done business there or visited there or worked there or lived there, you'll get a much more balanced view of things than you will. There's lots of sort of hearsay about things, and actually Qatar, we had a great time in Qatar, and it's a great place to do business. It's a very small place in many ways, but it's different from other places. And you go to Kuwait, where I go more often these days, that's different again. And but they all have their attractions and their pluses and minuses.
Sure, that's brilliant, Mike. I'm going to give you a rest now while you can have a quick glass of water and turn to Ali the physio, because you must do. I wonder how many miles you've flown, Mike, and I wonder how many air miles you've got in your back pocket. But flying puts a lot of stress on our backs, on our necks, etc. And Ali, if you can unmute yourself and give us a few tips for when we're flying, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all. So the first thing is, what are you putting in your luggage? Because most people, I guess those of you that fly a lot perhaps don't do this. I'm talking personally here. We all take more than we need. And when we take more than we need, we have to carry heavier bags than we ought, which is always difficult. And the worst thing really is the overhead baggage, getting up into the locker above your seat. Be very careful that you don't put everything really heavy in that one bag, because I've got lots of people I've treated who've actually hurt their necks and their shoulders from heaving that bag up, and then the plane moves or somebody bumps them or whatever. So biggest tip then, think carefully about your luggage and pack it carefully. Make sure it's not too heavy. Get yourself one of those little blow-up cushions that you can put behind your neck or behind your back in the seat. If you're going first class like Derek always flies, then that's not necessary, of course. But if you're like me and you're going in economy, you need your cushions. So that's important. And I think the other thing I always tell people is move as much as you can when you're in the seat. Sitting still, I've been saying this for the last however many weeks we've been doing this, sitting still at your computer isn't good for you because everything seizes up. Sitting in an airplane seat in an awkward position, asleep or whatever, isn't good for you. So move your feet up and down, wriggle around. You probably annoy the person next to you, but you'll feel much more comfortable when you get off that plane, and you won't get a DVT, hopefully. That is a thrombosis in your leg. So there you go. There's a few tips for you.
Thanks, Ali. We'll be back to you a little bit later. I don't remember flying first class unless I was drunk, but I do remember flying Qatar Airways to Australia and having so much champagne that I wrote most of my book on the way out there, because after 3 glasses of champagne, you can get really in the zone. I don't recommend it, and it's probably not the right thing to do. Mike, before we move away from the Middle East, I'd like to turn to Iran and Iraq. I know you've worked in both those places. And I do believe you told me once you worked for an Iraqi bank in London and you never went to Baghdad. Was that really true?
Yeah, it was actually. That was, all down to the negotiating skills I learned from you, Derek, I think. Yeah, so they're different places. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? But, it'd be surprising how many people are confused by that. And it's worth, regardless of what you're doing there, just understanding a bit about history. And there's a great program on the TV at the moment about Iranian art or Persian art. And it really tells you a lot about the history in the context of the region. And, Farsi is very different from Arabic. So they're different. I only went to Tehran a few times, so it's not the easiest place to go or do business, but I must say when I went, I had a fantastic time. People are incredibly welcoming and hospitable, but doing business there was very difficult. And this was before sanctions, so nowadays it's impossible. So it's probably not on anybody's list, I don't think, which is a shame because there's some interesting places to visit. Iraq, I was asked to set up a bank for the Iraqis after the war, and had a great time putting everything together. And then typically for that country, unfortunately, there was a major political change and they changed their minds, so it didn't happen in the end. So I had an interesting couple of years trying to do all the bits and pieces with the regulators over here, but never got off the ground. But dealing with the people there was interesting. And you have to remember, actually, a lot of the people that certainly in financial services that I was dealing with had careers in major international institutions or had been educated overseas. So, you were dealing with people that were sort of generally used to dealing with the Western business world, if I can put it like that. So, but that was fun while it lasted.
And it all comes back to the tribes they were originally in, different religions, Sunnis and Sunni. I can't remember the other one. And
yeah, it's probably not something that we need to discuss very much, I don't think. But I mean, it's certainly partly because it's a difficult area. And it's fraught with sensitivities, and but the important thing for people going there, regardless of whether you're on holiday or business, is to understand the cultural differences, whether they're religious or otherwise, respect them. Dress sense, for example. You have to be very careful about sort of being immodestly dressed in certain environments. It's obvious. A lot of this is common sense, but you'd be surprised how many people get it badly wrong. So, understanding a bit about the religious context and the differences, probably not a topic you want to discuss with people, really, because it's a bit too personal, maybe.
Okay. Now, Mike, you said last week you had a conversation with someone in New York and a conversation with someone in the Middle East, and I remember you giving me almost their opening gambits, and they were totally different, which was a great story. Can you share that?
Yeah. Well, it was really just it struck me as a stark illustration of the differences of the way business is conducted. And it happened on the same day. I had 2 Zoom calls. And one was with a US investment bank, and the other one was with a Middle Eastern investor. And the first one was the US investment bank. So never met these people before. So, Zoom, hi Michael, hi Jim. Right, what's the deal? So no, how's COVID? How are you coping? Are you well? How's the football? How are Arsenal doing? None of the sort of normal preamble. It was straight into it. And I thought, okay, anyway, fine, you deal with that. An hour later, I had a Zoom call with a Kuwaiti investor. And it was 10 minutes. How's the family? What's it like? You still in lockdown? And we had this sort of nice, warm, personal conversation before we got into the business conversation. It just struck me as being illustrative of how things are done differently. It's a while since I did business in New York, but in New York it's pretty focused, and there is personal interaction, but it's not the way things are done in the Middle East and in Japan, where I have some experience too. There's always a bit more time for this sort of amicable, not too personal, but just a general, how's everything, how's the family, what's your news, that sort of thing. You know, and I think you can get it wrong both ways. You can, you know, steam into a meeting in Tokyo or in Qatar and say, right, let's get on with it. You know, this is what we want to do. And of course, you know, that's not going to work. So you've got to be prepared to invest time to sort of build that personal relationship before you can get into it.
Fantastic, Mike. Now, you had a Japanese boss when you worked for Numira, I assume, or a Japanese boss's boss or whatever. How did you find working for the Japanese? What were the cultural differences there?
I had two different Japanese bosses, actually. It was not as difficult as you might imagine, I have to say. I was fortunate, maybe, but I had a really excellent boss who was very supportive. When I worked for Nomura, actually, my biggest challenge, goes back a bit to my first comment, was transiting from Barclays, in my case, a sort of very, at that time, a fairly staid, conservative, well-established UK clearing bank, and working for a securities house or an investment bank, where it was a totally different culture, where, you know, it was get on with it. It was odd, really, because, you know, in a Japanese organization, because actually Japanese structures are pretty hierarchical, and that sort of trading environment maybe is a little bit alien. But so that was probably the biggest factor for me, just adjusting to that, which you do in time. But there are differences in Japan too. I mean, in some ways it's a little similar, I think, in my experience, to the Gulf, in that that things tend to happen at a pace, and there are quite a few people in the decision chain, in my experience, or a lot of decision making, certainly for key things, would generally be done at head office rather than in London, in my case. So you have to be patient a little bit. And it's interesting, and again, listening to your comments on negotiation last week, very often, you know, that conversation that you might have with your counterpart in an organization in a different culture or a different environment, in many cases I found that conversation, despite the fact you may feel you've negotiated a deal, you would not know whether that was successful or not, because there would be a point of reference beyond it. You talked about good cop, bad cop, didn't you? You always have a point of reference, and that's one of the things that, you know, works very well, I think, in that culture. That you know, I'd like to help you, but I need to refer it to, you know, my head office or the sheikh in the Middle East or something, just to get, even if they've already, you know, done a deal with you. So you have to be a bit patient sometimes, and just understand the position the person you're dealing with is in. You know, they may be a decision maker, they may not be, but, you know, there's always a higher authority, I think.
Any difference in other Asian countries, or even to Australia, where I had a couple of interesting negotiations myself?
I haven't dealt with Australia at all. It's I would imagine it's probably more close to the UK environment. I don't know culturally, but no. I think what else have I done in Asia? I mean, I had some experience in dealing with Chinese way back, and that was similar to the Japanese. That, you know, the head office was very important, and you know, it was a little difficult to read exactly where you are. There was this sort of, sometimes in a negotiation, I think you probably know this better than I do, you can sense from your body language thing, or just the knowing the person the other side of the table, whether you're winning or not.
Sure.
That's not always the case, I think, in a foreign environment. You may not know quite where the power lies or what the signals are. And that's where patience sometimes and that personal relationship can make a big difference.
Absolutely, Mike, and you've really touched on a hot spot there, haven't you? It's all about relationships. It's about personal relationships, about building rapport. How well do you know the people, and to actually take a local with you. I found in Australia that when I stayed with the second generation Brits, that was fantastic. They all lived in North Perth. In fact, Steve Wiltshire lived up there, and a couple of other pals that we know, and that was great. But when I went to Melbourne and Sydney, I found it totally different, and I found them a bit offhand. And from the Speaking Association, having Tim here, I went to Australia as the president of the UK Speaking Association, and they were pretty offhand with me. They were asking me questions like, why have you come? As blunt as that. And then they said, oh, well, you know, we're all sitting around the table here for dinner, but we suggest you go off and buy your own drinks, which I found absolutely extraordinary with my culture. So I positioned Australia in between us, not as close to the UK as I thought, as I thought, closer to America.
That's interesting. Well, in a way, you just sort of reinforced the point I made about, you know, assuming because you know Dubai, you know the Gulf, the GCC, and you know, there are differences here. I was probably true in the UK. You know, it's I guess Tim would say if you're dealing in New York, it's probably different from San Francisco or Texas or wherever. You know, the way things are done is different. So I guess we have to be a little bit more nuanced in assessing that. And you know, maybe it's different in Newcastle to Southampton. I don't know. But
I think it is. They speak differently for a start, but I often say there's 6 different cultures in the UK, really. There's sort of London, there's the Southwest, there's Newcastle, there's Scousers in Liverpool, and then there's Scotland, and we could go on forever. And you have to treat people with respect, don't you, when you go into their world? And we've been talking about that all through these programs. You need to put yourself in the other person's shoes, do your research, do your preparation, etc. Before I come on to Europe, Mike, which I'd like to touch on, I'm thinking that Ali's sitting there about to give us another couple of stretching exercises. Can you do that for us, Alison, please?
What sort of stretching exercises would you like today then?
Well, the sort of ones that I always need, sitting here a bit hunched up.
Okay, so actually I'm watching you all. You're all sitting quite nicely, really. But remember, shoulder blades back and down. I love the way you all sit up straight when I say that. It's power, you know. Shoulder blades back and down as if you're folding them down into your back pockets, and that immediately opens out your chest so you can breathe better. And then just take your head round to one side, give it a little stretch there, back to the middle, and then round to the other side, and you'll feel that right down into your shoulder blades. And then you can do the side bending one, which is really useful. So down to one ear to shoulder, back to the middle, and down to the other shoulder. And then just a few shoulder rolls, backward shoulder rolls. And just doing those few things, you'll relax the muscles around your head and shoulders, you'll breathe a bit better, and you'll probably feel a bit more awake and a bit more lively and less stiff, hopefully. There we go.
Fantastic.
Enough.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Bring it on. We need lots more of that, and we need lots of reminders, or at least I do. And I think it's when we concentrate is the problem, isn't it? When we concentrate hard, we lift our shoulders. And so when I did that exercise, Alison, I got a few clicks out of my neck. Is that good or bad?
That's absolutely fine. You've just got some clicks because you've got things moving. Okay. So don't worry about clicks. If they're painful, that's a bit different. But if it just clunks because you move it, mine just did then, that's perfectly fine. It's just been in one position for a bit too long, maybe.
Okay, brilliant. Mike, can we return to Europe now? We've got some pretty tricky negotiations to do this country between now and the 31st of December. I think the tough ones will be in November. I know you've worked all over Europe. I've worked all over Europe. We start thinking about the Germans and the French. That's quite different. And then we throw the Italians in and a few other places. And it's a pretty tricky arena. What's your experience?
Well, I think the hard part of this is, you know, it's not even a 3-dimensional negotiation. This is it. I don't know how many dimensions there are to it. So I wouldn't fancy doing it myself. My experience is one of the stark things. You mentioned timekeeping, for example, and again, it's difficult to generalize, isn't it? Because you talk about Germany as being like this. It's like saying, you know, all Brits are trustworthy. But you know, you can't make sweeping statements like that, really. But it's just the way things are done is different. And I guess my experience when I was doing one of the jobs I did was involved traveling 1 week to Greece and the next week to Norway. And well, it's obvious, isn't it, that they're different places. One's a bit colder than the other, but the big difference you notice is just the way things are done, and it's both just from a negotiation point of view that, you know, the Norwegian style is sort of very quite formal and quite regimented and quite cold in many ways. Maybe that reflects climate as much as anything, who knows. The Greek style is very different, and your point on punctuality, is noticeable there. So, you go to meetings in Norway or Denmark or Sweden, and it applies in other countries too, Germany probably as well, that if you're not there on time, if not slightly early, then it happened to me more than once. If you're late, then they make you wait a long time because it's rude and disrespectful, and time is precious and you have to be there on time. If you in Greece, if you get there on time, they think something's wrong with you. You say, well, the meeting's not, it's 11 o'clock, really, so there's this sort of, time is not so important in certain parts of the world. Actually, it's true in the Middle East too, that punctuality and flexibility with your calendar is really important. And Brits, I don't know, we're probably closer to the organised, diary says 9 o'clock, you meet at 9 o'clock. Okay, maybe there's a bit of a latitude, 5 or 10 minutes either way. I, for one, I don't know if I'm typical, but I hate people turning up without an appointment. I used to when I was working. I like to have things in the diary, and if you go to the Middle East, then you're expected to go and meet somebody at 9 o'clock at night because something important has cropped up. So, and the same, to an extent, is true in Greece. A lot of the conversations and negotiations I used to do in Greece were sort of late at night, and that was, it was a social element to it. Maybe not entirely, somewhat artificial maybe sometimes, but that was part and parcel of it. Norway, you finished at 3:30, and that was it. So maybe they're not the best examples, but there are clearly differences, and I would imagine, I'm not an expert in all the countries of Europe, but there's probably shades of that in everywhere, and maybe the further south you get, the warmer it gets, the way those attitudes differ a little bit.
Yes, there certainly seems to be a North and South Europe, doesn't there? And Justin Urquhart-Stewart was talking about that on Wednesday on the programme, saying that, the southern European states are fed up with Germany calling the shots, but the Germans are fed up with bailing out the southern European states. And of course, the point he was making there was without the flexibility, Britain's got to set its own interest rates. The euro is setting its interest rates, and they're probably being set in Frankfurt. That was the discussion, but we don't really want to go there. I thought that was great using Norway and Greece as the two examples, because they are about as far apart as you could actually think. I remember running a course in a bank vault for SEB Bank in Stockholm, actually. It was freezing cold. I couldn't believe it. We went out to dinner, and a German guy picked a fight with a Norwegian guy, and I was trying to mediate it, and I could see that the cultures were totally different. They were both speaking in English, which I don't think helped, but we had to back off and make a bit of a timeout because it was getting a bit risky. But SEB Bank, the Swedish bank, had a number of different cultures from all over the world. I didn't know why we had to do it in a bank vault. I was a bit concerned someone might shut the door and we'd never be seen again, but that was another story. Tim, I will bring you in a bit later, if I may, from the take from Texas, and also Gregor, if there's a take from Slovenia, just for a couple of minutes. But before we do that, can we talk about body language, Mike? Because, I'm a massive fan of reading body language and picking people's body language out as signals. There's a number of signals which don't cross cultures. And I remember this one as the first one, the AOK signal, which in America, I believe it means AOK. In France, it means zero. And in Tunisia, it means I'll kill you. And it's also quite a rude gesture in a number of countries. So we do have to be careful with body language. Thumbs up also means good things in some countries, but I think in Asia, it's a bit of a dodgy signal as well. Have you got anything to share with us in the body language stakes?
Well, I always hesitate talking to you about body language because I know you're watching what I'm doing and trying to work out whether I'm telling the truth or not. So, well, there's the obvious ones. I think there's some in your book actually, but things like and you can do this research quite easily online if you're going somewhere. So don't show the soles of your feet, for example, in the Middle East. That's considered to be disrespectful. The thing about handshaking is a really important one, actually, and I think it's you must shake hands with a male if you're a male. You should not shake hands with a female in the Middle East unless the lady were to offer to shake your hand. Certainly, kissing is not expected. Well, I mean, occasionally you'll find yourself kissing the men, but if you're a man, rather than the women, but certainly not the women. Actually, I don't know, actually, for just thinking about it, but I would assume, and I've never thought this through, apologies for that, but if you're a lady visiting the GCC, whether you would expect to shake hands with another lady. You probably wouldn't shake hands with a man, but you might shake hands with another lady, I think. So those are sort of obvious things. In Japan, there's a big rigmarole and ritual around business cards, which is very important. You know, I've seen people turn up at meetings and, you know, lob their business card at a Japanese person, and you know, that's really rude. So you don't do that. There's this sort of formal, you don't have to bow, but you know, this sort of formal presentation, and then you take it and you read it and look really interested, rather than just shove it in your top pocket and think, I'll do that later, or file it or put it in the bin. So there's lots of little things like that, and other things such as where you sit in meetings. These aren't quite body language, but they're sort of part of the etiquette, really. Where you sit in meetings is important, and you know, if you're important, you'll be invited to sit close to the principal in most cultures, I think. If you're relegated to near the door in Japan, you know that you're not doing very well, and it's because if you're near the door, it's where the chap might come in with a sword and get you. So there's some history behind that, by the way. So a few tips, but you know, there's a couple. I've found a few online, things that I didn't know either. But going back to my first point, though, you learn a lot by observing, and if you're doing these things with somebody that's certainly not necessarily somebody who's local, but somebody who knows the territory. It's not just, you know, I'm talking about places I know best, so I'm sure this applies to all parts of the world. Just watch what people do, and don't sort of impose your Western ways on things. You know, you're not, just because you're, you know, British or American or whatever, you're not any better than anybody else. And sometimes you do sense that arrogance, actually, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Mike. And in fact, we have grown up a bit on that, haven't we? In the 1980s, all the negotiation books were written by Americans, and it was a bit my way or the highway. And there's some fascinating stories about what happened in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine in some of those negotiations, trying to find peace. It's a bit my way or the highway, although there is an element of that I'm seeing coming from the White House at the moment, but Tim's told us about that a few times. Tim, have you got anything to add to what we were saying, or any quick questions for us? If Tim's there. Guys, Tim's muted at the moment. He's trying to unmute.
Okay, there we are. I'll get this yet. The question that I have is, in the past, I've worked with executives who did work in the Middle East, and they had a great deal of difficulty for the simple reason that they were women. Have those traditions slowed down, or have they changed, Michael, to the best of your knowledge? Do women have more trouble negotiating business?
I think it's better than it was. I think, and I know quite a few women who have done really well in those environments. I think some places are easier than others. Having said that, I think it's a while since I was in Saudi Arabia, but people use Saudi Arabia as one of the most difficult places to do business. And I think that applies whether you're a man or a woman, by the way. But I mean, for a while, it was a bit more difficult to get visas to go there as a woman than it was a man. But I think I mean, things have relaxed there a bit under the new leadership, so I think that's better than it was. And I don't know whether it is the right answer, but my last boss when I was in Qatar was a woman, and I worked for a bank which is essentially a Kuwaiti bank, and she wasn't Kuwaiti. So that's a sort of positive sign, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the board members or the executive committee members of the bank in Kuwait was a woman. So there's been an improvement. And I don't think it's as difficult as it was. The other thing I would say actually is I found increasingly that the decision makers in certain of the local companies in the Gulf are increasingly a younger breed of people. And they are not always men and women, and many have been educated overseas, a lot in the States actually, a lot of big college in the States. So there's that air of understanding of the need for diversity. The bank I'm involved with at the moment, from our Kuwaiti board members, they've been pushing for increased diversity and more women on the board, which I think is a positive sign too. So good. I have not experienced it firsthand, so I'm sure there are examples of people that find it difficult, but I think probably better today than it was 10 years ago, I would say.
Good news. Thank you.
We've got a question in the chat box, or a statement in the chat box from Jill. One time a friend who used to work in the Foreign Office told me that the Bukra, not burqa, B-U-K-R-A, was in the Middle East a bit like manana, but without the sense of urgency.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. Bukra means afterwards or tomorrow, I think. It is... it's one of the things, I was going to mention this, so thanks for reminding me, is that it's difficult to know sometimes where you are because, and again, I draw the contrast with America. If you say, have we got a deal here? The answer will be yes or no, generally, and I think you'll get to a point. You'll rarely get a no in the GCC. And you'll get an answer like Bukra or Inshallah, which is the other phrase that you will hear people, God willing. And sometimes that's just a way of saying, well, we'll see what happens, and you may get this deal, you may not. And what, not always, but what sometimes will happen is that you won't get a decision, but you'll know fairly soon that the answer is no. I don't know whether that's because people find it difficult to say no, or whether they don't want to offend you, etc., or whatever. But again, these are generalizations, so I'm sure people have examples where this isn't the case. But so that is a little bit of the case actually of Bukra or Inshallah. Tends to be a little bit of we'll see what happens, but often means don't raise your hopes, I think.
Fantastic, Mike. We're nearly coming to the end of this interview. I'll be turning the recording off in a minute, and then people can ask you any other questions if you can stay with us for a little while.
Sure.
I remember when you were helping me write the hotspot, the chapter in Win-Win in my book. We came to the conclusion straight away that there's no right answer to any of this, and there isn't an answer. You need to do your research. You need to talk to someone, which is the benefit of having a big network, someone who's worked in that country, someone who works in that country, and find out what the cultures are and find out how people will react to it. I mean, the City of London is a very different place to being out in the country in the UK, and I'm sure it is anywhere else. So it's very difficult to generalise when people ask me for advice on how to work in the UK. So you need to find out where people are coming from, what their interests are, the what, why, how are we going to deal with that. So Mike Williams, thanks for joining me today. I hope you'll come back and join us again. And thanks for your time. Thanks for your very valuable advice. And we'll catch up with you soon. Thank you.